as is the reality of how many people in Australia need more than one job to make ends meet. Now, we've talked about cost of living all year long. We will again next year, because it is the number one concern of Australians. We have been living Albonomics now, which is a few breadcrumbs to the union movement, a huge amount of government spending, and people in the middle class, well, you get squeezed harder than ever. It's been practiced by a far more left-wing treasurer than we've had in a very long time, that being Jim Chalmers, a man who, remember, wants to remake capitalism. This is a bloke who's well and truly got tickets on himself, and as a bloke who would like to be the Prime Minister one day, he is from a different generation, a different political generation, one that, when it comes to the centre-left of politics, plays a lot tougher than those whom have ever been able to lead our country before. But we got some news this week from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, you know, that far right-wing think tank, that tells us almost 1 million people in Australia have more than one job. Now, yes, there are a lot of people who do this because they only can work 4 hours at this job and 4 hours at another job. But you know and I know that the number of people who end up having multiple jobs in the country is a sign of the number of people who are struggling on minimum wage jobs to be able to have enough money, even after working the best part of 40 hours, to be able to pay for everything that, as you know, has been going up exponentially since this government came to power. And just in case you think it's just me who's making this up as a potential political issue, if only I had an example of a politician before they became Prime Minister who tried to scandalise numbers that were nowhere near 1 million people with more than one job in Australia.
So many people are doing it just so tough. 500,000 Australians are working 3 or more jobs.
Well, the reality here is I can't tell you how many people are working 3 and 4 jobs, but I can tell you that people with multiple jobs, now 955,000 people. It was under 800,000 in 2020. And in terms of the hours that they work, again, they are working longer hours than people who end up with a single job. But you can see here that male multiple job holders, they are working way past 40 hours, almost 45 hours a week. Female multiple job earners, they are working with one job, the best part of about 25 hours, and the next is another 10 hours that gets into about 35 hours a week. Overall, the average hours that are worked in the secondary jobs is about 10 hours a week. But overall, the best part of 40 hours is put together by not one but 2 jobs. Now, of course, the reality is that people need to do that because paying off their house is more expensive, the fuel is more expensive, everything to do with the kids or the grandkids is more expensive. And the reality is that if you are in a certain series of jobs that don't pay a lot, you have to have more than one job to be able to find a way to pay for everything. But then there's, of course, the government and how government treats a second job. Now, remember, your tax-free threshold of up to $18,000, well, it applies to only one of the jobs that you have. The other one, of course, you turn around and you end up getting taxed on, which means that people who are working 2 jobs to make ends meet are ending up paying some taxation that they probably don't need to. And we all know that Kerry Packer put it best about why we all go to our local accountant and try to push down our tax bill each and every year.
Now, of course I am minimising my tax, and if anybody in this country doesn't minimise their tax, they want their heads read. Because as a government, I can tell you, you're not spending it that well that we should be donating extra.
Can you believe that? That's the best, 32 years ago? And it's just as correct 32 years later in 2023, back in 1991 is when he made those famous statements. Meantime, interesting thing about the tax office that I have to mention here. Now, the tax office has decided to start introducing a whole bunch of letters that they're sending to people, and they're being generated by computers to tell people that they owe money to the tax office. Now, obviously, if you owe money to the tax office, you should be paying it. But wasn't this what happened when it came to people in the dole? Literally, I don't know when this scheme started, but the reporting certainly started about it deep into this government. In fact, I only started to learn about this just a couple of weeks ago. And again, this was a system that seems and smells a lot like robo-debt. A computer deciding who owes the government money and those people being sent demands for the money. And remember how outraged this government was when that scheme both was in play and out of play.
The former government broke the law when it came to robo-debt with disastrous consequences.
These are the people who decided to operate a robo-debt system, which operated completely outside the Australian law, was found to be illegal and cruel.
The Liberal Party's robo-debt scheme was not an innocent mistake. This was a deliberate, calculated scheme. It was a costly failure of public administration in both human and economic terms.
The robo-debt was a cruel and crude mechanism.
Now, I think there's a company called Robotax, so you can't call this Robotax, but they're going to come up with a name that sounds almost as good as Robodebt in terms of politics here. Now, the tax officers turned around and said, well, we'll try and have a look at the system. But the very same people who in part came to power because of the computer sending out debt notices to people who were welfare recipients are the people now in charge of the tax office doing the same. Now, of course, you would assume that if there was a Conservative government, this would be cause for outrage, but it's a Labor government and the media is desperately trying to change the subject back to the reform of the greatest government of all time. They'll bounce back in the new year. But I think there might be a little more to run in this, so we'll talk about it when there is more reporting on it. Meantime, also worth noting here today, there was an essential poll that comes out via the Turnbull Times, the Guardian website, in between begging for donations. Now, the best headline they could put on this, because remember, they're pro-Albo. Financial woes trigger frustration with Albo and mistrust in institutions. Now, that is burying the lead if ever I've seen it. Because if you actually go and find the place on the internet that will tell you what's in this poll, 51% of Australians think that the country is headed in the wrong direction. That could have been the headline rather than financial woes trigger frustration with Albo. What about 49% of people who say that this year was worse than they expected? 51% of women, that was their view, 46% of men. And 32% of people who believe that things will get worse next year. 30% say no difference. So if you put those two together, it's more than 62% of the country who think that next year is going to be as bad as this year or maybe even worse. Only 24% of people, Teal voters, think that it's going to get better. And where are the areas where people have told a left-wing pollster that they expect things to get worse? Well, 74% of people say their power bill is going to get worse. Geez, I wonder if the government plays a role in that. 73% of people say grocery prices. Geez, I wonder if the government plays a role in that with the tax that they have put on truckies who are moving groceries around the country. Rent and mortgage. Geez, I wonder if the government has anything to do with their own spending when it comes to inflation that may well affect interest rates, because 68% of people say their housing is going to go up. 59% of people say that interest rates are going to go up. Unemployment, 47% of people think that unemployment will go up. Yet only 19% of people believe that their wages will actually change at all. But as you know, we're currently in a perception fight where, despite the fact that the reality for most Australians is that this year was worse than they expected, they know the government plays one heck of a role in that, and many people's expectations are that things get worse next year, including the things the government can control. The government is trying to do its Jedi mind trick. We are in control of the economy. We are doing something about cost of living. But as you know, they're not really, which produces weird headlines like this, where I've got to say I've read this about 3 times today. 10 billion more in spending cuts, which are aimed at the inflation fight. Now, most people only read the headlines, so they'll turn around and go, oh, good, Albo's doing something about inflation. But then you can just read the first paragraph of the story and you can realise there's a big asterisk here. Almost $10 billion in federal spending will either be cut or pumped into other priorities. So $10 billion. So imagine if they only cut $1 billion overall, but they move $9 billion somewhere else. But they're trying to claim credit for $10 billion worth of cuts. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that I don't know how much, part of that $10 billion is going to be cut from the overall government spending. But the rest of it is just still going to be spent. It'll just be spent over here now. And that will magically do something about inflation. Of course, the media, again, look for this. This is going to be the theme of the end of the year and the theme of the start of next year. Everyone in that Canberra press gallery who never wanted to print a bad story about Albo, the ones who aren't telling you about the censoring of the damn internet in a free speech country, are the people who will try to tell you that down is up and up is down about this government at the end of the year and why they've turned things around next year. Remember, It's not what they say, it's what they do. And everything this government has done has made your life harder, more difficult. Oh, yeah, and by the way, you know how Jim Chalmers used to say that the reason that everything was so high was because of the war in Ukraine?
We've got an inflation problem in our economy because we've got a war in Ukraine.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as supply chain shortages, has had an impact on global inflation.
We've got an inflation problem in our economy because Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine.
Russian invasion of Ukraine and the implications of that are reverberating around the world with global inflation.
And then they turned around and said that it was all to do with the war between Israel and Hamas.
Don't be on the road. It is not a safe situation while the cyclone is passing the coast. Those residents near the coast should consider the need to evacuate because it is likely to be above the highest astronomical.
Well, of course, they're now turning around and blaming the war in Israel and Gaza, not Cyclone Jasper, my apologies. Well, now, guess who the latest one that they are blaming? Fire ants. Yeah, they say fire ants are part of the reason why the government's not able to actually do anything in terms of cutting its own spending or just moving money around but still spending the majority of that $10 billion. Apparently, the Treasurer and the Finance Minister will reveal on Wednesday in the mid-year budget update that despite trying to reduce expenditure, the government will have to spend more money in areas of ranging from controlling an outbreak of fire ants to the removal of a decrepit oil production vessel in the Timor Sea. I say all of this because here they are. They keep having a go. They keep having a whack. They'll blame anyone. No responsibility. They'll be about as transparent as a brick and sometimes be about as sensible. And either way, you have to pay for it.